Welcome and good morning. We'd like to welcome you to today's webcast regarding ACA compliance. And we want to thank each of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to discuss what has become a very, very hot topic for many of our friends and clients. I'm John Heath. I'm Director of Professional Services here at Carr, Riggs & Ingram. And first I wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping things. You will receive a link to the webinar content, a recording of today's session later today. Next, phones are muted. Therefore, please submit any questions that you have through the question functionality in the software in the link that you received from us. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's team. Facilitating today is Chris Off with his head Hoffman. Chris is a graduate from the University of Tennessee. He and his wife have two boys, one 6 and one 3. Chris enjoys Hilton Head and taking walks with his two boys and their two dogs. Presenting today, we have Martin, the Mad Hatter Copeland. Martin graduated from the University of Alabama. He and his wife have 3 kids. Their oldest is in her second year of law school at Cumberland Law in Birmingham, and he's got 2 twins, 17. His daughter is homeschooled and is an apprentice glass artist in Fort Payne, Alabama, and he's got a son who's a senior at Swanee Prep in Swanee, Tennessee. Martin enjoys canoeing and camping. And when he's not listening to Alabama and Randy Owens, he's very IT savvy and he geeks out on IT stuff. Also speaking today is Helen, the March Hare Speak. She and her husband have a 2-month-old daughter, Lily. Helen was born in the USSR. She's worked for 2 Big 4 firms and in industry, and now we're glad to have her here with us. Helen loves to travel. I was tracking her travels, and she's been to about 20 different countries. I think I lost count at about 20 anyway. She's traveled around the circuitous loop, gone as many different places as it seems the regulations and rules have for ACA. She loves dogs, she loves to scuba, she loves gardening and photography. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Martin Copeland to discuss the ABCs of ACA.
Thanks, John. Today's topic is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, commonly shortened to the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, and that's how we'll refer to it in the presentation. You also know it as Obamacare. And we're going to give you detailed information about completing the new 1095 and 1094 forms required by the law, but before we get to the forms, we need to paint a picture of the implementation challenges employers are facing in gathering the data they need for compliance. Now, the Act includes 2,700 pages of law with 20,000 pages of regulations and counting. And we invited you to this Alice in Wonderland ACA Tea Party webinar because, like Alice's adventures, reading the ACA rules can seem like literary nonsense. Our approach for bringing order to the madness will be to break the components of the employer reporting responsibilities into 3 sections. We'll briefly discuss what causes an employer to be subject to the ACA and which employees are affected by the ACA. We'll go over the ACA's health insurance standards and penalties for not meeting the standards. And finally, we'll study the newly required 1095, 1094 forms in detail, exploring the process of gathering accurate data, the penalties for not properly filing the forms, and challenges to completing the forms. So, to help us navigate the employer responsibilities associated with the ACA, we developed this adventuresome flowchart. Now, some of you will remember a cartoon strip named The Family Circus, drawn by Bill and Jeff Keane. Billy, the young boy in the family, could never seem to go straight home. There was always something more to see and do. Well, this flowchart reminds us that our lawmakers seemingly took Billy's approach and did not craft a straight path to reporting compliance. The flowchart is, however, a serious tool that will help you understand the most important employer-related provisions of the ACA. In fact, we'll use this flowchart as our outline for today's presentation. Now, as we get started, I want to bring up our first polling question. We want to find out a little bit about you. We'd like to know how many employees on average work for your organization. Is it less than 50, 50 to 99, 100 to 499, 500 to 999, or 1,000 plus. And if you would go ahead, Chris is going to help us with this poll, and I'll let you take it, Chris.
Thank you, Martin. So please, everyone, go ahead and register your poll results now. As people register in, I'll go ahead and close the poll here in a few seconds. A few housekeeping reminders that John mentioned earlier. If you have any questions, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a questions toolbar. Please feel free to submit those questions. We'll answer those during these polling breaks, and then again at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to go ahead and submit those questions. With 92%, I'll go ahead and close the poll now. And we'll see, based on this, it looks like almost 40% are fall in that less than 50 category, but there is a significant 25% with 100 to 499. So it looks like there'll be quite a few people interested in the next section, the applicability of the ACA. Martin?
Okay, thanks, Chris. And as we begin our discussion of applicability, let's first take a high-level look at the ACA. The ACA was signed into law in March of 2010, but much of the law is being phased in over a period of years. And some of the most significant employer responsibilities are effective in 2015 and 2016. Now, the stated purpose of the ACA was to increase the quality, availability, and affordability of health insurance. It introduced mandates that employers offer health insurance to their employees. But while described as a mandate, the ACA does not actually include direct requirements. Instead, penalties known as the play or pay rules offer a strong inducement to participate. And by the way, the employer penalties are also known as employer shared responsibility payments. Now, the purpose of the new 1095 and 1094 forms is, as we'll see, twofold. The forms document employers' compliance with these rules while also providing information employees need to complete their individual income tax returns. Okay, so here we see our first flowchart section. It's a depiction of the passageway to ACA applicability. Our graphic tells us that applicable large employers, our abbreviation is ALE, are subject to ACA rules. So you have to ask a question. Is your company an ALE? Well, an oversimplified answer is that employers who averaged 50 or more full-time and full-time equivalent employees in the preceding year are ALEs, with full-time employees being those that work 30 or more hours a week, and full-time equivalent employees being a calculation totaling the hours of all employees that work less than 30 hours a week and dividing by 30. For example, 2 employees that both work 15 hours per week would equal 1 full-time employee. Now, those employers that began operations in the current year must make a good faith estimate of their qualifying employees for the ALE determination purposes. As you'll find out in our upcoming benefits baseline discussion, ALEs must offer insurance coverage to full-time employees. And it's therefore important to identify full-time employees and part-time employees in the current reporting year. But those calculations are separate and distinct from the ALE qualifying employee calculations. So now you know if you are an applicable large employer, right? Well, not so fast. When we said the ALE answer was oversimplified, we meant it. As an employer, even if you had fewer than 50 qualifying employees, you still might be an ALE, because sometimes your relatives can make you an ALE. If you're under common ownership, you may be an ALE. And if you were part of an affiliated services group, that is to say related companies that provide services for each other or third parties, you may be an ALE. So if, as an employer, you have relatives that may cause you to be an ALE, the total full-time employees and equivalents for all related employers must be combined to see if the whole group has less than 50 qualifying employees. Finally, if you and all of your relatives have less than 50 full-time and full-time equivalent employees, you are not an ALE, and only then can you say the ACA rules are not applicable to you. So, the takeaway from our discussion of ACA applicability is that employers should seek professional guidance in calculating their full-time equivalent employee numbers and determining the entities that should be aggregated when counting. And CRI can provide you with that assistance. Now, we're going to jump right to our polling question number 2. And what we'd like to know is what type of health insurance plans your organization offers. Do you have a fully insured plan? Do you have a self-insured or self-funded plan? Do you have a multi-employer or union plan? Do you not offer health insurance, or are you unsure? And you may have multiple answers to this question. So Chris, help us with this poll too, please.
Thanks, Martin. Everyone, please go ahead and register your results now, register your answers now, and we'll show the poll results in a second. Martin, one question I had coming in for you is, what time period do employers use to assess their full-time and full-time equivalent employees for ALE status?
Yeah, Chris, I briefly touched on that. You're actually looking back at the preceding year to do that calculation. So really, the preceding year, I realize we're late in 2015, but the preceding year is actually 2014 for that determination.
Thanks, Martin.
Does that do it?
With 90% in, I'll go ahead and share the poll results. We have about 74% have a fully insured plan, 20% self-insured plan, and then 4% on the other categories. So from here, Helen's going to discuss the benefits baseline.
Chris, good morning, everybody. So now that you have determined that you're an applicable large employer or an ALE, what are the ACA requirements and standards that you must meet? I will spend a few minutes to walk you through the topsy-turvy road of health insurance coverage requirement, the ACA standards related to the offered health insurance, and last but not least, the penalties associated with non-compliance. Now, why are penalties such an important part of our discussion today? Here's why. ACA non-compliance penalties can add up to significant amounts that may heavily weigh on your company's performance. Let me show you how and what you need to do to minimize the risk. Chris, if I can get some help with slides. Here we go. Here is section B of the flowchart that Martin showed you earlier. As you can see, there are several topsy-turvy roads that lead you through the maze of ACA requirements world, just like Alice in Wonderland. If you're not careful, the road may take you to the queen who shouts, "Off with his head," and IRS will hit you with the penalties. And just like Alice, you want to keep your head. Here's how. The most important requirement to remember is that as an ALE, and unless you're subject to transitional relief terms, you must have offered minimum essential coverage to at least 70% of your full-time employees and their dependents in 2015, and you will certainly have to offer minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of your full-time employees and their dependents starting from 2016. A non-compliance with this requirement can trigger a penalty that may hit you like a sledgehammer. This is how it works. If just one of your eligible employees purchases health insurance coverage through an exchange and receives a federal subsidy, then you, as employer, will get penalized. This so-called sledgehammer penalty is calculated as $2,000 times the number of full-time employees, less 30 employees. So say if a company has 430 full-time employees and just one person takes subsidized health care through an exchange, then the sledgehammer penalty is calculated at 430 employees, less 30 employees, times $2,000, which equals $800,000. Actually, in 2015, 80 employees may be deducted instead of 30, just to ease the transition into full compliance. Now, let's assume that you have complied with the first requirement and offered minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of your eligible employees. Are you in safe waters now? Not yet. There are several ACA standards for health insurance coverage offered that employer must comply with. First, minimum value requirement. Your plan's minimum value must be at least bronze. What this means is that it must be designed to pay for at least 60% of covered healthcare expenses. Second, affordability requirement. The health insurance plan offered must be affordable. How do you measure affordability? IRS has provided 3 safe harbor methods that I will cover in a few minutes. So what happens if either one or both of these 2 ACA standards on offered health insurance are not met? Like Alice, you must again face the Queen. In case of non-compliance, employer will be fined $3,000 for each employee who qualifies for and accepts a premium subsidy for coverage purchased through an exchange. This penalty is also called sometimes a scalpel penalty. It is very important to make 2 notes about penalties. First, if an employer fails on all requirements or entire Section B on this slide, then this employer pays the higher of the 2 penalties, but not both. Second, these penalties are non-deductible for tax purposes to the business. Since employee insurance coverage requirement is heavily based on full-time employee concept, let's talk about the definition of full-time employee versus part-time employee. It is very important to understand that identifying yourself as an ALE and determining eligible employees correctly depends on an accurate determination of full-time employees and full-time equivalents. This determination is not as easy as it seems, and you may end up falling into a rabbit hole unless you consult with experts. Identifying full-time employees can get even trickier if you have employees with irregular or seasonal work schedules, such as in construction business, in hotels, restaurants, retail industry, or even more so if you use contractors who have been historically issued 1099s. Some employers may choose the safest road and offer minimum essential value coverage to all employees, as if all were full-time. However, if you have a lot of variable hour or seasonal employees, this may not be a reasonable option for you. So here are some pointers to make the full-time determination easier. In general, full-time employees are those who are reasonably expected to work at least 30 hours per week on average. The IRS interprets this as 130 hours in a month. When hired, these employees should be considered full-time as of the date of hire, and they should be offered coverage. They must be able to enroll within 90 days of hire. Typically, employers should make an offer of coverage within 61 days of employment. So who are potentially not full-time employees? First, employees whose full-time status cannot be reasonably determined in advance because the employee's hours are variable or otherwise uncertain. These employees must be evaluated to determine coverage eligibility based on whether they in fact worked more than 30 hours per week on average. If so, they should be offered coverage. Second, seasonal employees. The ones who perform labor that by its nature is not performed continuously throughout the year and may only be performed at certain times during the year. The determination is focused on the type and duration of the work performed. Strategically, it is really important for employers to have good tracking and measurement system to determine which employees are truly eligible or non-eligible. So how do you measure and track your employees' hours? Regulations provide 2 optional methods for determining full-time employee status, the monthly measurement method and the look-back measurement method. In the monthly measurement method, the employer counts hours each month to determine if an employee meets the 30-hour week threshold for full-time status. If an employee qualifies in a given month, the employer has 2 additional months to offer coverage. This monthly measurement method is a simpler way to count. However, few employers are expected to use this monthly measurement method because it is administratively burdensome. So, therefore, we are going to discuss the look-back measurement method in this presentation. Before we go into more details, first let's look at the definitions of 3 different periods which are important to understand in relation to look-back method. First, standard measurement period. This is the look-back period that employer selects to measure whether employees are full-time or not. Second, administrative period. This is an optional period for employers to analyze data collected during standard measurement period and notify and enroll full-time employees. Third, stability period. This is the period where employee eligibility determination is held constant, no matter how many hours they work during that particular period. So how does the look-back method work? All ongoing employees have the same standard measurement period. Each new employee has their own initial measurement period instead of standard measurement period. Measurement period A determines eligibility for the entire subsequent stability period A, regardless of the actual hours the employee may work during that subsequent stability period. This flowchart illustrates really well how measurement and stability periods overlap. Employees will be in both measurement and stability periods at the same time. What this means is that during the stability period A, when eligible employees' coverage remains in place, they are also in the next measurement period B to identify whether they will be eligible for healthcare coverage in the next stability period B, and so on. Companies are allowed to insert the maximum 90 days of administrative period between standard measurement period and stability period. General parameters for standard periods for ongoing employees are as follows. Measurement period can last from 3 to 12 consecutive months. Stability period usually lasts same as standard measurement period, but not less than 6 months. Administrative period may last up to 90 days. To coordinate the measurement period with an employer's calendar year plan and allow time for administrative period, the employer could actually implement a 12-month standard measurement period that ends within 90 days of the beginning of the calendar year plan. As I mentioned earlier, the measurement periods vary for ongoing employees versus newly hired employees. Each new employee has their own initial measurement period instead of standard measurement period. It is allowable and advisable to begin initial measurement period on the first of the month after date of hire. This way, you as an employer can have one group per month. Few key points for you to remember before we wrap up this section. First, document your determinations of eligibility with supporting data. Keep the final report as proof of which employees are actually or deemed to be full-time and can subject you as employer to penalties. You have to have the report available to counter IRS penalty assertions once it happens. Most importantly, seek help from your accountants, like ourselves, to assist with measurement and determinations now, rather than later after you have faced the Queen. Here's a recap of the important ACA requirements that you need to remember to minimize your risk of penalties. Most important, ALEs must offer minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of their full-time employees. Minimum essential coverage means that there are certain specific services that must be covered. Your health insurance brokers and carriers can guide you to the right plan here. The 2 other important requirements related to the health insurance coverage offered are, first, the minimum value requirement. The plan must pay at least 60% of the total cost of medical services. And second, the affordability requirement. The plan must be affordable. How do you determine affordability? Here's how. Each employee's required premium co-share for the lowest cost self-only coverage that provides minimum value should not be greater than 9.5% of household income. Since employers do not have readily available access to employees' household income information, the IRS has actually provided 3 safe harbor methods based on information that is more readily available. This means that employees' required premium co-share for the lowest cost self-only coverage that provides minimum value should not be greater than 9.5% of an employee's W-2 taxable income. This is in box 1 on W-2. Rate of pay as of the first day of the coverage period, or the federal poverty level for a single individual. So now that we've covered basic requirements of ACA compliance, how do you track full-time employees? How do you monitor coverage and report compliance? Before we move on with this discussion, we have our next polling question coming up. We would like to know, how prepared is your organization for ACA reporting? Here are the options. You have not yet begun. You intend to outsource, but no solution has been identified. You plan to implement an in-house solution, or you already have implemented an in-house solution or an outsourced solution, or finally, you're unsure. Chris, would you like to take over?
Thanks, Helen. I want everyone to go ahead and log their poll results now. Helen, there is one thing I wanted to bring up with you, which you covered, and I wanted to emphasize. You mentioned the penalties in the benefits baseline are non-deductible for tax. And I want you to talk on that further as companies weigh their options of whether they should drop health coverage or not, how that non-deductible penalty should be factored into that.
Well, Chris, the reality is that ACA will cost employers one way or another. And it really boils down to looking at your strategy and the options available, looking at the history of how many employees have signed up for health insurance in the past, weighing your options. I have had a lot of discussions with our clients where they actually choose to offer health insurance to all employees and consider everyone full-time just because it's less risk of ending up being penalized, and especially if their employees have not been very active in signing up and the participation in healthcare plans has been low. This may be a pretty interesting option. But to answer your question in few words, it all depends, and we need to know more information to provide good strategy for each individual case.
Thanks, Helen. And we find that with a lot of ACA questions, the answer many times is it depends. I'm going to go ahead and share the poll results right now. It looks like there's an even split. There's about 27 who plan to implement it, and 27% plan to implement an in-house solution. 20% not yet begun. Another 20% already implemented an in-house or outsourced solution, and everyone else either intends to outsource or is unsure. So now I'll hand this off to Martin, who's going to cover the control and compliance aspects.
All right, Chris, thanks. You know, Alice, a stranger to Wonderland, realizes the fantastical nature of the world that surrounds her and must constantly work to navigate and understand it. But now Alice was able to keep her wits and her head. As employers, you have to maintain that level of control to navigate this new ACA land. Well, since the IRS is responsible for collecting data and assessing penalties related to the ACA, you should rightly expect that compliance includes filing forms. In this case, those forms are numbered 1095 and 1094, and we'll study those in depth in the next few minutes. I will point out here that the primary compliance penalty for failure to file these forms correctly is $250 per 1095. So we'd like to help you as an employer understand how to prepare accurate forms. In our opinion, controls over employee and health insurance data are the key to ensuring that the data is complete and accurate, and that employers comply with the reporting requirements to the IRS and to employees. But why are we starting a discussion of form preparation with data control considerations? Well, it's because so much of the data needed to complete the forms and comply with the rules is often not stored in one single location within an employer's organization. As relevant data is collected and compiled into one database for reporting, to maintain accuracy, it's important to validate the information. Now, I'll mention ACA compliance software several times as we move through the presentation, but here I will say that systems are available to handle the data consolidation and verification that I'm describing, helping you to see the forest of data through the seemingly overwhelming trees of detail. Now, lest you think this combining of details is an easy task, this chart helps to visually understand the items that must be collected. You see that we've marked the likely places where information may be found, but there's really no such thing as a one-size-fits-all data source chart that applies to every employer. This page represents needed employee-related data. And you should note that several lines refer to collection of monthly data, not just year-end totals. This continuation represents employer-related data. Again, you see that calculations are necessary to gather monthly data. Now, some payroll software products have added specialized reports to help with calculations, but most have not. An ACA compliance software product can assist employers with making the needed calculations. Well, we talked about the data needed, but what about the forms themselves? For ACA reporting, there are two sets of potential forms identified in the rows of our chart. They bear similarities to W-2 forms in terms of distribution and filing deadlines, but they are much more complicated to complete. The employee information forms are numbered as 1095. The employer transmittal forms are numbered as 1094. The sets are lettered B or C depending on the employer type and the plan type. There is, by the way, a 1095A form, but it's distributed to individuals by the health exchanges, not by employers. Now, we show three employer type columns across the top of our chart. Small employers, which are those that have fewer than 50 full-time and equivalent employees, those are our non-ALEs. And small employers treated as large, now those are employers that are ALEs as a result of controlled or affiliated group, or as we've been saying, their relatives. And those large employers that reach ALE status even before consideration of related organization. So take a look at the rows. You can see that far and away the largest number of yes answers are in the 1095, 1094C boxes, and apply more specifically to the two ALE employer groups. The 1095 and 1094B forms are designed to provide information about health coverage for employees and their dependents, and we do see some single asterisks and yes answers in the B row. So the single asterisks indicate that the B set forms must be provided to all covered employees regardless of employer type, but will generally be distributed by insurance providers, not employers. And even though most requirements do not apply to small employers, they are nonetheless required to provide B forms if they have self-funded health plans. But the double asterisks show that the two ALE type employers can use the 1095C forms to combine B and C information instead of having to complete both forms. Now the conclusion then is that most employers will file the C set of forms. And take note here that ALE members must send 1095-C forms to all full-time employees regardless of whether they elected coverage or declined. Well, everyone seems to be getting that panicked, I'm late for a very important date feeling about ACA reporting. And it is true that the data on the forms will include information back to the beginning of 2015, but by following an organized plan, there is yet time to work our way through the adventure. Our timeline tells us that, well, like the March Hare's watch, even IRS time is a bit delayed for these filings. Forms must be sent to recipients by February 1st of 2016, since January 31st is a Sunday. And if using paper forms, employers transmit to the IRS by February 29th, 2016, not the 28th, since next year is a leap year. In fact, those employers that wish additional delays can file by March 31st, 2016 if filing electronically. And electronic filing is, in fact, mandatory for employers submitting 250 or more forms. And one more delay, a 30-day filing extension will be granted for paper or e-filing of transmittal forms by completing Form 8809. However, additional delays for distribution of employee forms are unlikely, since employees must have their 1095s to complete their personal income tax returns. All right, we said that the C set was most prevalent, so let's dig in and go a little deeper. And I got to tell you, as an IT specialist, the information required to complete the 1095-C form just literally took my breath away the moment I saw the draft. Although it's filed annually, reporting information by month, as is required, is a potential nightmare rivaling the one that Lewis Carroll imagined for Alice. Now, looking at Part 1, as with most IRS forms, there's basic information required, such as the employee and employer names, addresses, and tax ID numbers. In Part 2, lines 14, 15, and 16 paint a very detailed picture of each employee's health plan enrollment status for each month, and we'll study those lines in a moment. In Part 3 of the 1095, employers that have self-funded health plans are to enter the name and Social Security number of each employee and family member covered by the plan each month. All right, now let's look at Part 3, lines 14, 15, and 16 in depth. And as the old saying goes, the devil is in this Part 2 detailed information. Line 14 provides an indication that the employee and family members were offered minimum value health coverage each month. There are 9 possible codes, and the codes can be different each month for each employee. So let's take a quick rundown of those codes. 1A indicates a fully qualifying offer of health insurance coverage was made to the employee for this month. 1B indicates that coverage was offered to the employee only. 1C indicates coverage was offered to the employee and dependents, but not the spouse. 1D shows that coverage was offered to the employee and the spouse, but not dependents. 1E indicates that coverage was offered to the employee and the dependents and the spouse. 1F indicates that coverage that did not provide minimum value was offered to the employee or the employee and or spouse and or dependents. 1G indicates that the employee was not a full-time employee in that month, and 1H shows that no offer of health coverage was made that month, while 1I indicates that the employee was eligible for a qualifying offer transition relief in that particular month in 2015. Now clearly I'm not trying to teach the codes. I want you to get a sense of the number of decision points needed to make the proper selections. Now, earlier I mentioned that ACA software could assist with compiling accurate data. Well, ACA compliance software can also determine, through business logic, which of the 9 codes in line 14 should be applied each month for each employee without the employer having to choose the correct codes themselves. In line 15, the employer's share of the monthly premium for the lowest cost minimum value health coverage offered should be entered. But note, this is not necessarily the actual insurance premium paid by the employee. And as before, if implemented, ACA compliance software can determine, through logic, which premium contribution should be applied each month for each employee. Now in line 16, the affordability safe harbor for the employee each month is documented. We discussed those safe harbors in our earlier benefits baseline explanations. But here again, there are 9 possible codes, and the codes can be different each month. So here's a very quick summary of those codes. 2A indicates that the employee wasn't employed during that month. 2B indicates that the employee was not a full-time employee for that particular month. 2C shows the employee enrolled in the offered coverage for the month. 2D indicates a newly hired employee was in a limited time non-assessment period for that particular month. 2E shows that a multi-employer, normally a union plan, interim relief rule was applied in that month. If the W-2 affordability safe harbor was selected by the employer, then 2F should be entered. If the federal poverty line affordability safe harbor was selected, the employer enters 2G. Or if the rate of pay affordability safe harbor was applied, the employer selects 2H. And finally, 2I indicates a non-calendar year transition relief applies to this employee for the month. Now, I know I'm emphasizing the point, but if implemented, ACA compliance software can determine which indicator code should be applied. Now, as you can see, we firmly believe that employers need comprehensive compliance software to accurately complete the 1095s. There are form completion software products available, but those lack business logic and rely too heavily on decisions and intervention by employer staff members. Now, the 1094C is a transmittal form used to summarize the employer's health insurance offers to their employees, and to report their compliance to the IRS. It includes, in Part 1, basic employer information such as name, tax ID, address, an ACA-specific contact person and phone number, and the total number of 1095Cs being submitted. Part 2 of the 1094C includes information about aggregated ALE, group status, associated form totals, and certifications of eligibility for particular transition relief rules. The certifications in line 22 are particularly important for employers in 2015 due to the availability of transition year penalty relief provisions in the rules. By marking box C on line 22, eligible employers claim one of the 2 important penalty relief opportunities. The first relief provision is potentially available to ALEs with fewer than 100 full-time employees, including full-time equivalents. While this relief is often assumed to apply to all 50 to 99 employers, to actually qualify, an employer must have met the following conditions. First, the employer must have been an ALE or part of an aggregated group that had 50 to 99 employees, including full-time equivalents, in 2014, the preceding year. And then from January 9th, 2014 through December 31st of 2014, the ALE or the ALE group cannot have reduced the number of employees or overall work hours of employees in order to qualify for this transition. And from February 9th, 2014 through either December 31st of 2015, this year, or the last day of their plan in 2015, the ALE or ALE group member cannot have eliminated or materially reduced the health coverage that it offered as of February 9th, 2014. So to get this relief, you do have to follow some special rules. Now, the second important relief provision potentially applies to ALEs with 100 or more full-time employees, including full-time equivalents. If an employer is an ALE or part of an ALE group that had 100 or more full-time and equivalent employers in 2014 and is subject to an insurance coverage penalty, as we described earlier, then the penalty is calculated by reducing the employer's number of full-time employees by that employer's allocable share of 80 rather than 30. But note here that the 80 employee reduction is allocated among the employers in an aggregated ALE group. And then, depending on information entered in parts 1 and 2, employers may need to continue with parts 3 and 4. And in part 3, if employers are able to mark line 23 all 12 months, reporting is much easier. But otherwise, providing monthly totals will be cumbersome. Those details include whether the employer offered minimum essential coverage each month, the number of full-time employees each month, the total number of employees each month, and an indication of which of the two penalty transition reliefs that we just discussed were applied by marking box 22, line 22, box C. All right, Part 4 of 1094C is used to provide names and employer identification numbers of other employers in a controlled or affiliated group. In other words, you have to claim your relatives whether they remind you of Wonderland's menagerie of characters or not. Now notice again that a number of key employer decision points must be documented and that much of the needed data must be compiled monthly. So as with the 1095s, the takeaway is that employers need ACA compliance software to complete the 1094 and 1095C forms. And importantly, most employers need assistance in making sure there are adequate controls over appropriate data so that these forms can be prepared accurately. And CRI can provide the assistance you need, including assistance with implementing ACA compliance software that will interface with different software products and payroll processing services. So hopefully our discussions have given you some of the backgrounds you need to fulfill your employer reporting responsibilities, and we'd now like to share some information about the next steps we recommend you take towards implementation. Chris, are you going to help us with that?
Yes, thanks, Martin. And now that we've covered the ABCs of ACA, you know you can't jump directly into preparing 1095s and 1094s directly. You have to start out with the A's, the applicability of the ACA. Are you an ALE? You then have to move into the benefits baseline. Is your company offering the benefits it needs to avoid some of the penalties that Helen talked about? Then finally, after getting through the first two is when you can get to the C aspect, which is the controls and compliance of ACA, and specifically the 1094, 1095 reporting. CRI professionals have the advisory and business support expertise to help your company in some of those decision points, whether it be assessing your ALE status, determining what potential penalties you may face, or implementing the ACA software that Martin mentioned. And to help you in that process, we are also offering a free ACA compliance readiness assessment. What this will do is it'll help you understand where you stack up in your ACA readiness, additionally help you determine what your next step should be. So how this works is we have the website acacpafirm.com, and what that is an online questionnaire that you can go fill out. It'll ask you a couple of questions about your company. Based on those responses, they'll get funneled back to a CRI ACA professional who will reach out to you and schedule your free 30-minute consultation. During this consultation, the CRI professional will ask you some follow-up questions, kind of engage you in dialogue about your company, and then give you a sense of where your company stands in its ACA compliance process. The professional will also give you kind of the next steps of where you think, where we think you should be heading, and suggestions of how to get there. In addition to the readiness assessment, I also want to draw your attention to the online resources that CRI has available in our ACA Compliance Center. And the website is acareportingcompliance.com. On that website, we have a white paper specific to ACA. We have articles. We have a calendar with dates to remember. Just posted an article on the Cadillac tax, which will be rolling out in a few years regarding ACA. So it's a good reference point that you can go download some articles and some resources and read through them as well. So now we will go ahead and open up the floor to any questions. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the questions dialog box on the right-hand side of your screen. First one that has come in is for Helen. It comes in from Stephen, who asked about the affordability safe harbor. Specifically, is the 9.5% rule on the affordability safe harbor, does that apply to single-only coverage? Helen, do you help us out with that?
Yes, Chris. Yes, this is correct. This is applied to single-only coverage.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And I think regardless of whether the individual elected family coverage or group coverage, and for purposes of the affordability safe harbor, you only have to apply that 9.5% to the single-only coverage, regardless of what they have elected. Got a question for you, Martin. In looking in your crystal ball, do you foresee Congress delaying any of the 1095 reporting requirements past next January?
No, Chris. You know, these requirements have been delayed a couple of years, and you know, really, these forms are now required. They're actually baked into what's required to prepare an individual tax return this year. So I really don't see any way that at this point that these reporting requirements can be delayed. We all kept hoping for it, but you know, it just didn't happen. I think we're there.
Thanks, Martin. And I'll add on, really, in the ACA world, the IRS is trying to match up the individual mandate, where individuals are required to have coverage, and this 1095 reporting is one way that the IRS can find out and match up who has that coverage. So I agree with you, Martin, that I don't foresee this being delayed, as the IRS wants to proceed in that matching program. Martin, got another question for you from Tim. Does a 1095 form need to be filed for employees who are terminated during the year?
Yes, if an employee was a full-time employee at any month of the year, then yes, they will have to have a 1095-C.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Another question just came in from Sharon. Companies have had to disclose the cost of health insurance coverage on the W-2 for employees. Is that still required, and if so, does it apply to all companies, all size companies?
Yeah, Chris, that's box 12, it's code DD on the W-2 forms, and those rules have not changed, but it is limited to companies that had 250 or more employees in the preceding year. That's the way the rule has been. Nothing's changed about that.
Okay, thank you. So for Sharon's question was specific to companies with less than 50 employees. Those size companies would not be required to report the cost of health insurance on W-2s.
That's correct.
Another question, Martin, on the transitional relief. You mentioned companies in that 51 or 50 to 99 range have this one-year transitional relief. For those companies that fall in there, are they still required to file 1095s for 2015?
Yes, indeed, they are. That relief only applies to the penalties that Helen talked about in our benefits baseline section. You are still required to file the 1095s, and those penalties, filing penalties, do apply, even if you're in the 50 to 99 employer size.
Thank you, Martin. Another question came in about specific to the penalties, so I think this is for you, Helen. can a company be penalized if an employee opts out of health insurance coverage offered by the company?
Chris, this is a very good question. It really boils down to whether there is good documentation that supports employees' denial of coverage. If there is sufficient documentation and proof of employees' denial, then no penalties should be applicable in this situation.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. I may have confused the situation when I was talking about the individual penalty. When I was talking about the 1095s and the IRS matching the 1095s to individual coverage, there are penalties on employers for not offering coverage. There's also penalties on individuals for not having health insurance coverage. So I think in a situation where an employee opts out of health insurance coverage, the penalty that may be imposed on the individual for opting out. It would not be a penalty on the business itself. And I think we are winding down on time now. I see a few more questions have come in. I would encourage you to go ahead and go to the free consultation website, acacpafirm.com. Those can handle, in that 30-minute consultation, your CRI professional will be able to handle fact-specific situations that you encounter. So any additional questions that aren't answered on this webinar, please submit that form online, and our professionals will get answers for you. I appreciate everyone attending today's webinar today. Hope it's been informative for everyone. I thank you, and have a good day.